Imagine if a single translated word literally changed the course of religious history. No, really. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're embarking on a super fascinating textual investigation. We're going to look closely at an author's deep dive into one of the most fiercely debated ancient texts out there. We'll be exploring linguistic forensics, a massive geopolitical crisis from thousands of years ago, and a debate about how biblical texts are actually read and interpreted. If you're into history, language, and uncovering the hidden layers of ancient documents, you are absolutely going to love this. So here is the central question the author of our source material is posing today. Does the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible actually predict Jesus? For centuries, specific verses from these ancient translations have been cited as absolute proof of later New Testament claims. But the author challenges this idea head-on. They argue that when you read the words strictly within their historical and textual context, an entirely different story emerges. It's a pretty massive claim. Let's look at exactly how the author builds this case, piece by piece. Okay, let's dive into this and establish some groundwork. The foundation of this whole debate rests on something called the Septuagint, which is often abbreviated as LXX. Essentially, it's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that originated way back in the 3rd century BCE. According to our source, in the early centuries of the Common Era, this specific Greek version was highly elevated by non-Jewish followers of Jesus. They began to rely on it heavily, sometimes even venerating it over the original Hebrew text. The author points out that this Greek text basically became the absolute go-to source for New Testament writers when they wanted to quote older scriptures. And that brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the debate. The author translates the Greek version of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14 like this. A ruling authority will give a signal. Look, the Parthenos shall have a child in womb. This is the incredibly famous Immanuel prophecy, and the author's entire argument hinges on that one specific Greek word, Parthenos. What did that word actually mean to the person who wrote it down all those centuries ago? To figure that out, we have to strip away centuries of assumptions and do some real linguistic forensics. Section 1. Investigating Parthenos, a linguistic forensics case. The author starts by pointing out how this exact word is defined in many modern Christian-oriented lexicons today. If you look up Parthenos in sources like Step Bible, the definition is incredibly rigid. It strictly defines the word as someone who has never engaged in sexual relations, right? It implies absolute sexual purity. If you only read this specific definition, you'd naturally assume the ancient text is explicitly promising a miraculous biological birth. But why does this matter? Well, because the author asks us to dig a little deeper into the broader historical records. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast when the author pulls from standard historical Greek dictionaries like Little Scott Jones, Strong's, and Thayer's. Sure, it can mean a pure virgin, but Little Scott Jones specifically notes it was used for unmarried women who are not virgins. Strong's simply says a maiden or unmarried daughter. Thayer's even includes a young, newly married woman. That is a massive departure from a strict virgin. The source material argues that the root meaning of the word in ancient Greek was far, far more expansive than modern religious lexicons suggest. It was primarily a descriptor of age and social status, not a medical condition. To really cement this linguistic argument, the author brings up a crucial piece of internal evidence from the Septuagint itself. In the Greek translation of Genesis chapter 34, verse 3, the word Parthenos is used to describe the biblical character Dinah. But context is literally everything here. The text applies this word to Dinah after she has just been raped. This is a profound detail. The author argues this is definitive proof, within the Greek text itself, that Parthenos does not strictly mean a sexually intact person. It simply meant a young woman of marriageable age. Part 2. The geopolitical crisis. Zooming out to King Ahaz. The source makes a super fascinating pivot here. Even if we completely ignored the linguistics, right? Even if we pretended the word absolutely meant a strict virgin, we still have to zoom out to the immediate historical context. We're in the era of King Ahaz or Ahaz of Judah, and things are dire. The kings of Aram and Israel have teamed up and are actively attacking Judah. King Ahaz is absolutely terrified. In response to this immediate panic, God sends his spokesman, Esaias, with an urgent message. Esaias tells the king not to worry, promising that these two specific enemy kings are gonna fail. The entire prophecy is anchored to this very real, very immediate military threat. To prove these enemy kings will be defeated, Esaias gives King Ahaz a highly specific, time-bound signal. Step 1, a young woman will conceive a child. Step 2, the child will grow, eating butter and honey. Step 3, the child reaches an age where he learns to choose good over bad. And Step 4, which the author points out is the most important part. Before the specific child is old enough to know right from wrong, the lands of those two attacking kings will be completely abandoned. The author's conclusion here is incredibly straightforward. When you read the text exactly as it's written, the young woman, even if you insist on calling her a virgin, and her child are set strictly in the era of King Ahaz. The timeline is immediate. The child's growth is literally a ticking clock for the destruction of the invading armies standing outside the city gates. The source argues that absolutely nothing in this context forces a reader or even invites a reader to look 700 years into the future. The signal was for Ahaz, for his specific problem on his specific day. And that brings us to part 3, the final comparison, Esaias versus Matthias. And this brilliantly illustrates the crux of the author's argument. Because if the text is so deeply rooted in its own time, how did it become the bedrock for a New Testament claim? The author points to a subtle but massive difference in the wording. In the Greek translation of Esaias, it says, "A child will be born, and you shall call his name Immanuel." In the ancient Greek, that you is singular. But look at what the author of the Gospel of Matthew writes when quoting this exact same verse, "And they shall call his name Immanuel." The author argues that the singular you in the original Greek text points contextually directly to King Ahaz. Ahaz is the one standing right there. Ahaz is the one who's going to name the child. It binds the text tightly to that exact moment in history. But by changing the word to a vague plural they, the gospel writer effectively strips the prophecy of its original historical anchor. The author charges that the New Testament writer actually altered the words of the Greek translation to make a local immediate sign look like a generic far-off prophecy. According to the source, the passage was taken completely out of its intended historical context. So what does this all mean? It leaves us with a final, pretty profound question to chew on. Does reading ancient translations in their strict historical and linguistic context completely change our understanding of the text? The author of our source material definitely believes so. They argue that when we remove the lenses of later traditions, the original texts often speak of entirely different realities. It's a powerful reminder of why digging into the source material, looking at the raw data, and reading things in context matters so deeply. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning and keep exploring.